Josh, if I had known that had been you reading that tonight, I'd have given you 6 more verses. You did a good job. I don't know what you win, but something, I'm sure. That's not easy, is it? But you did a great job. Speaking of kids, I have tried throughout however many years I've been doing this, I've tried to be gracious with my own kids, with my own family as far as preaching goes. I've tried not to get up here and humiliate my kids and make object lessons out of them and all of that, even though I sometimes talk about them, obviously, but I've been very conscientious of that and tried not to do that. But I'm going to make an exception tonight. I think it is a good illustration of this. This reminds me sort of in a funny sort of thing. And actually, Adrian just mentioned this to me a little bit ago. But when Noah came back from Beginner's Week, he was not feeling the best. And I did the usual dad thing, which was, you seem fine to me, you seem all right, you know. And he said, no, I think I've got strep throat. And I was like, I'm sure it's not strep throat. And so after a couple of days or however long it was, he went to the doctor and wouldn't you know it, he had strep throat. So, well, I went a week years ago having shingles, and everybody told me I was too young to have shingles when I was 31. And so I went for a week in severe pain, like every other day I was in bed and couldn't get out of bed and in a lot of pain. And then finally somebody was like, I think you've got shingles. And so I went to the doctor and they're like, yeah, that's shingles. So anyway, he only had to suffer for like a day. But anyway, so strep throat, goes to the doctor, right? And gets up the next day, I think it was the next day or the day after that, and he's got pink eye. And so he tells me after that happened, and I think I told him he didn't have pink eye either. So I was like, nah, I don't think so. It's probably just allergies. So he ends up going back to the doctor after suffering with that, and sure enough, he's got pink eye. So he tells me afterwards, and there's a piece missing, but I have to leave it missing for the story's sake. He tells me afterwards that night, he was laying there in bed thinking, well, I had strep throat and I'm dealing with that, and then I got pink eye. How much worse could it get? Well, he woke up the next morning, he had pink eye in the other eye. So, you know, it's just one thing after another. And then I really felt bad for him because I just wanted him to tough it out. But obviously he was having a tough time. You know, when you read the opening chapter of Ruth, not to compare the two, but there's certainly a kind of downward spiral here, and that is what our author wants us to see. And really, aside from the fact that obviously these are real people suffering real traumas and one on top of another compounding, it's amazing to me how quickly all of this is laid out and how quickly it's presented to us. This obviously took place over some period of time, but it's all abbreviated into these few verses, what the author wants us to know that sets up the book of Ruth. And it's compounding problems. One bad thing happens after another. There's a famine in the land, and then they move on from there, and they're trying to find a place to go. They go to Moab. They've probably heard that the prospects are better in Moab, and so they go there, and lo and behold, the husband and the father, Elimelech, dies, and then the 2 sons are left, and it's just Naomi and her 2 sons, and then they take and marry Moabite women, and then before either of them can either have children or before one or the other could perform the Levirate law and raise up sons for his dead brother, they both die, and neither of them have any children. And all of this happens in just a few short verses, those first 5 verses that were read for us a moment ago. And so this downward spiral, this abbreviated downward spiral here is meant to get us to a point. And when you study the book of Ruth, I have found, and this is there's such depth, you know, to the scripture in general, and such depth to this book in particular, that we might get caught up in some of those details in imagining that the main lessons that we're to learn are in the details of all of that suffering and loss. And that's not to say that there isn't application to be made. There is application to be made there. There's a lot that we can learn from that. But some of the main things that tend to be pulled out of this part of the text, this introductory text to the book of Ruth, I don't think, and I'm always open to being wrong, but I don't think we're meant to tease all of that out and draw the sort of ethical conclusions from those events that are often drawn. I don't think that's the main thing that's going on. And so really tonight, what I want to do in these few moments is I'd like to drill into it, and I'd like to relate to you what I believe to be the single main point of relating to us this downward spiral, which reaches its not its apex, that'd be the wrong word. It's nadir, the other side, reaches its deepest part of its Marianas Trench, you might say, of casualty in verse 5. So that's what I would like to do. In order to do that, I'd like to think with you first about the significance of how it begins. Now it came about in the days when the judges ruled or governed. If you were here last week for the introductory lesson, the layers of meaning in Ruth, and I know some of you weren't, but we talked about the significance of the timing of this book. This first sentence in the book tells us where this account, this story, belongs historically. It belongs inside of the previous book, the book of Judges. You have the book of Joshua, then you have the book of Judges as they're arranged, and those are actually chronologically correct. But then you have the book of Ruth, and it's not laid there because it happens after the events in the book of Judges. It's laid next to it because the events in it take place within the events of the book of Judges. Now, there's a main instigating or factor or catalyst to get us to that lowest point in verse 5, and that's in verse 1, and that is the famine. It came about in the days when the judges governed that there was a famine in the land. I think that famine, coupled with the end situation in verse 5, are the two most significant things to think about in this section. Famine is something that you and I haven't had to think a whole lot about. I would imagine most all of us have been very blessed to be able to have food pretty much at any time that we've wanted it. Now, I know probably some of us have had a little less food maybe at some times than we wanted, or maybe not exactly the food that we wanted. But still, most of us have probably eaten every day. And if we haven't eaten every day, it was almost certainly by choice. Maybe there's exceptions to that rule, but I would imagine that most of us throughout the course of our lives have had something to eat every single day. But famine is a scourge in this world, and it continues to be an issue to this day. Famine did not go away. It didn't disappear from planet Earth. It's still going on. It's just something that is fairly well removed from our experience. But it's been a great scourge in the world, and it has cost, and there's no way to really make a tally. A lot of the estimates of famines, even into the modern day, are just that, they're estimates, but billions of people throughout the course of world history have died as a result of famine. So this has been and continues to be one of the most feared situations in the world. Not just the scarcity of food, but the absolute loss of food. And we have been very fortunate. Most of us have probably lived here in the United States, or have had at least the good pleasure of being able to go pretty much wherever we wanted to go, or live here in a country where we've had abundance. But people in other parts of the world don't always have that privilege. They don't have, speaking of Giant Eagle, they don't have a Giant Eagle or whatever that they can go to whenever they feel like it. I mean, I live a block from Giant Eagle, and I can go there pretty much any day. And it's weird. I'm sure you had this experience. You remember really early on in the pandemic when all of a sudden nobody could find toilet paper? Wasn't that the craziest thing? And pretty much most every day of your life, if you needed toilet paper or you needed eggs or you needed milk or you needed some staple item for your life, you could just go to the store. And if that store didn't have it in stock that day, the next store next door probably had it. I mean, this is actually unusual in human history to have this kind of access to products and to food. Most people in world history have not had this kind of access to food. Most people have lived on the raw edge of poverty and have just gotten by. Your parents' parents and their parents, many times, those folks may have eaten meat 1 day or 2 days a week. They didn't have it. They had bread and they had vegetables and things like that from the garden. But if they ate meat, maybe it was 1 or 2 days a week. That was the case with my parents' parents. We're a vastly different place today than it was even 100 years ago as far as that goes. Billions of people have suffered and died because of famine. And it's not just famine that kills. So when crops fail for a year, you might be able to make it. Most people throughout history have found ways to store and preserve. You might be able to make it a year. You might, if you're fortunate, be able to make it a couple of years. But think back to the time when Joseph rose to power in Egypt, and remember the dreams that he had? Those dreams were relative to a famine that was going to occur in Egypt, and it was going to last for 7 years. Preceding that, there was going to be 7 years of plenty, and so the order was made that so much of the grain was to be saved and siloed and stored so that during the years of famine, at least Egypt would have bread. And, you know, I'm sure probably still people died, as is typically the case. But it's not just the lack of food then that kills. There's other things that go along with that. People get very sick, disease becomes rampant, pestilence becomes rampant. And there's a lot of ancillary effects, and it can hurt people for generations. And so famine has been a great killer and greatly feared. You know, if you ever wondered what it was that sometimes caused Israel to worship some of the deities of the Canaanite people around them, when God brought them out of Egypt, Moses wrote for them. In fact, Moses met with God on the mountain, you might recall, in the book of Exodus, and came down with a set of, a civic code by which they all would live, the Ten Commandments. And then, of course, that then branched out into the entirety of the Old Testament eventually. But when God brought them out of that land, Moses wrote for them who their God was, that he was the creator, and that he was really the only true God. They were to have no other gods before him. And they weren't to bow down or worship any idol or anything like that. They were to honor the true God, who was the God of Israel. They were not to follow after the gods of the nations around them. Now, this seems like a pretty easy thing to follow. Okay, this is our God, and we don't follow the other gods. This seems like an easy thing. But there's a problem with that. When you're hungry, when you're starving, literally when people are starving, when your crops are failing, and I don't know what we would liken that to in our day. The only thing I can imagine perhaps it might be something like if you have been diagnosed with a grave or terminal illness, chances are you're probably going to go seek as much advice as you can to see whether or not this is worth your fighting, to see whether or not you can get through this, if anybody believes you have a chance. And you're probably going to utilize whatever resources you have, and you might even call upon resources you don't have in order to spare your life. We do this. Well, imagine if you don't have food for a couple of years and your children are hungry and you don't want to see them suffer. What kinds of things might you do to ensure that your children don't suffer? You see, those Canaanite deities that we read about in the Old Testament, particularly the Moabite deity Chemosh, or Baal, or Asherah, these were fertility deities. And that doesn't just have to do with human fertility, although it's related to that. This has to do in an agrarian age, in an agricultural age, to the fertility of the land, to the provenance of food. So why would they run away from Israel's God and go off to other gods and do whatever those gods wanted them to do, up to and including the sacrificing of their children to those deities? And they did do that in several periods of their history. Well, I don't know all of the reasons of that, but I suspect that at least part of the reason for that was because of times like this. Now, I know it seems to you and me that that's the craziest thing you could imagine. I just can't imagine allowing one of my children to be sacrificed to one of these gods. And I honestly don't believe any of us would do that. I think we'd rather die than do that. I understand that. But I also know that not only in this time period, but for example, in the period of the Jewish rebellion that began in AD 66, that the stories that were told of those Jewish people, and as they revolted against Rome, and as they found themselves holed up in certain places, they're horrible stories about, by the way, not just in AD 66, but going all the way back to the Babylonian siege of Jerusalem beginning in 606 BC. That as the enemy, the Babylonians or the Romans, whatever era this was, and it wasn't just there, this happened in other places as well, that when cities were besieged, when the water supplies were cut off, when they were surrounded by invading hordes and armies, these armies didn't have to come in and fire arrows. They didn't have to beat down the doors and get in. All they had to do was cut off the supply of water and food and starve people out. And the stories of the things that happened there, and by the way, God relates these things to us in both the Old Testament, well, he relates it to us in the Old Testament, and history relates it to us, what happened in the Jewish revolt that began in AD 66. People ate their own family members. So I know that's grotesque. I know that's the most horrible thing you can possibly imagine. But sometimes some people have done some horrible things. So why would any of these Israelites go off to these other gods and sacrifice their children? Well, it wasn't merely because they wanted to participate in these other things and some of the other stuff that was going on. Some of it probably was as a result of the fact that they were starving. And whatever god they thought they could pull the lever on and get a treat, that's what they would do. So when we read famine, to us it's sort of like this, oh yeah, that's an over there and back then kind of thing, which is not true. But it's significant. This is a horror, a true human horror. And so if you're familiar with famine and you read this text for the first time, you're horrified. Of course, Jewish people probably would have known about this, but you'd be horrified in a way that perhaps you and I are not. So, in response to this famine, and some people tend to make Elimelech's decision here to go to Moab as this was a deeply ethically flawed move on his part to leave Judah and go to Moab. I don't know that that's the point that the writer wants us to get. Is there a case to be made for that? Maybe. Maybe there is a case to be made for that. But my point is, I don't think that's what the author wants us to focus on. Elimelech decides to sojourn in Moab, and my guess is because they're starving to death. And so the certain man, Elimelech of Bethlehem in Judah, goes to sojourn. And the word sojourn is important too, because that means he didn't intend to stay. And again, you can take this point in itself and you can kind of make a lesson out of that too. And you can say, well, the decisions that we make have unintended consequences. Certainly his did. But again, I don't think that's the perspective that the writer is getting at. And so, how the story is usually told, Elimelech was wrong to go to Moab. Mahlon and Chilion, the sons, they were wrong to take Moabite wives. The fact is, it wasn't forbidden for them to take wives among the Moabites. Not at this point in history. And so, of course, the Moabites were kind of a cousin through Lot and his daughters of the Israelite people. And so usually what you will get sometimes in a study or in a reflection of this, sort of the ethical element of this, the moral of it is we shouldn't leave God's people for the world, which is Moab, and we shouldn't marry non-Christians or non-Jews, as would have been the case in those days. And those sorts of lessons seem to have an aspect of credibility to them. But the fact is, Elimelech wasn't forbidden to go to Moab. He intended to sojourn there, which means he just intended to ride this thing out and go back home. It's assumed that Mahlon and Chilion were not permitted to marry Moabite women. This is not the case at this point in history. I don't think that's the case that's to be made here. So, but I do think it's important to recognize one thing, which is the famine, and why there might have been a famine. You might remember, if you turn back to the book of Deuteronomy, and I'll try to do this as quickly as I can in Deuteronomy 28, God did make some promises to Israel. And so aside from the famine merely being the fact of the situation, I do think that there's something ethical connected to the famine. Because, and this isn't the only place that this is mentioned, but in Deuteronomy 28, the people of Israel are told, and this is just before they go into this land of promise. Beginning in verse 1 of Deuteronomy 28, "Now it shall be, if you diligently obey the Lord your God, being careful to do all his commandments which I command you today, the Lord your God will set you high above all the nations of the earth. All these blessings will come upon you and overtake you if you obey the Lord your God. Blessed shall you be in the city, and blessed shall you be in the country. Blessed shall be the offspring of your body, and the produce of your ground, and the offspring of your beasts, the increase of your herd, and the young of your flock." You remember the most feared killer of an agrarian society is famine? Well, you didn't know whether or not your livestock were going to produce. You didn't know whether or not your ground was going to produce. In this particular land, there are only two seasons of rain, referred to in the scripture as the early rain and the later rain. So there's no irrigation now there is now. They've just about dried up the Jordan River now, trying to irrigate this land in modern day. But they weren't irrigating. God made them a promise that he would send them rain, the early and the latter rain, not in this text, but it's also promised that he would do that, and that they would always be fruitful, that they would always have the produce of the land. God would supply this. As long as they were faithful to him, he would make sure that their livestock would produce, that their land would produce, and that they would produce. Now, why is this important? Again, I remind you, the deities of this land, the most important deities of the people in this land were fertility gods and goddesses. And people offered up their worship in whatever form that consisted in order to appease these gods to be fruitful. But God has promised them, I will provide this for you as long as you remain faithful. Verse 5, "Blessed shall be your basket and your kneading bowl. Blessed shall be you when you come in and when you go out. The Lord shall cause your enemies that rise up against you to be defeated before you. They will come out against you one way and will flee before you 7 ways. The Lord will command the blessings upon you in your barns and in all that you put your hand to, and he will bless you in the land which the Lord your God gives you. The Lord will establish you as a holy people to himself, as he swore to you, if you keep the commandments of the Lord your God and walk in his ways. So all the people of the earth that will see you, that will see that you are called by the name of the Lord, and they will fear you. The Lord will make you abound in prosperity, in the offspring of your body, in the offspring of your beast, and in the produce of your ground, in the land which the Lord swore to your fathers to give you. The Lord will open for you his good storehouse, the heavens, to give rain in your land in its season, and bless all the work of your hand, and you shall not lend to nations, or you shall lend to many nations, but you shall not borrow. The Lord will make you the head, not the tail, and you only will be above, you will never be underneath, if you listen to the commandments of the Lord your God, which I charge you this day, to observe them carefully, and to do not turn aside from any of the words which I command you today, to the right or to the left, to go out after other gods and serve them. Now, what do you think? That's all the blessings. What do you think is going to happen if they don't obey God? Famine and plague and pestilence. Your ground will not produce. You will not have children. Your livestock will not produce. Remembering that this book is set in the period of the Judges, which is a dark time for Israel, I will suggest this to you. The famine is almost certainly God's judgment on the nation. It may or may not be a judgment on this family. I'm inclined to believe, and you can differ with me, and many that I've read after do, and that's perfectly fine. I could be wrong. I don't believe we're introduced to this family because God is condemning them. I do believe that this family is caught in the same circumstance as everybody else as God is judging the nation. I feel very confident in saying that if Israel is undergoing a famine, it's not a happenstance. God promised them as long as they were faithful, they would never endure these kinds of things. Here they are enduring it. Therefore, I believe the famine is a judgment of God. So, I think that's the true ethical failure that underpins the book, not necessarily anything that anybody has done here. I don't know that Elimelech's decision is to be condemned to go to Moab. I don't know that the two sons taking wives of Moabite women is condemned. The scripture, in fact, does not say that is the case. I think the ethical failure is the nation, and they happen to be caught up in it. Now, in this famine, all this downward spiral of death that resulted in this family in this situation, I think it's all related to us in service to something far more significant. Far more significant. That this appears to be, this is the apparent end of God's promise to redeem the world through a human descendant. God promised in Genesis chapter 3, when man first sinned, that the seed of woman would come and that he would bruise the head of Satan, or crush the head of Satan, even as Satan crushed his heel or bruised his heel. That's Genesis chapter 3 and verse 15. God promised a descendant, a seed of woman, very generic sort of promise there. But he repeated this promise beginning with Abraham in Genesis chapter 12, and then repeated it to Isaac and then to Jacob. And the promise gets a little more specific as the years go by. He made a promise even more specific when Jacob blessed Judah by inspiration in Genesis chapter 49 and verse 10, that the scepter would not depart from Judah. God promised to preserve this nation, and in particular the tribe of Judah in Genesis 49:10, until Shiloh, the Redeemer, comes. Here in the book of Ruth, the genealogy appears to have ended. Elimelech has died, but he has two sons. The sons surely will go on and find wives, and they will have children, and the bloodline will go on. Unfortunately, these two sons also died having no children. When the sons die and have no children, there is no one to carry on the family name. There is no one to carry on the bloodline. This is the central event of Ruth. This is the point of the downward spiral. How bad can it get? It's not just that people have died, as significant as that is. It's that all the heirs and all those who could have an heir have died. And now how then will God fulfill his promise? The family is obliterated. A question for you. You don't need to answer out loud just for your reflection. With what major event does the book of Ruth end? It ends with the birth of a child and the continuing on of this family. If you only had the first few verses of Ruth and you only had that little section of chapter 4 in which Ruth is now married and Naomi has a grandson, you would say, how in the world did we get from the bloodline being obliterated, that which was supposed to carry on God's promise? How do you get from that to there all of a sudden being a child in the picture? That is the point as far as I can tell. That's the purpose. And the lowest point is not just that people have died. It's that anybody who could have carried on this lineage have all died. And there is seemingly no hope and no way of seeing into the future how it is that God is going to rectify this. And the beautiful thing about the book of Ruth is that apparently God does nothing. Nothing at all. Now, that's not to say that God doesn't providentially work. That's not to say that God's unseen hand isn't in the book. Of course it is. God's hand is in the life of every person, and particularly his own people. So I'm not arguing that God isn't present. Of course he is. I'm not arguing that God isn't doing anything at all. But really, in the book of Ruth, God is more or less absent. The way in which this situation is resolved is not by God stepping in and bringing about, like he did in the instance of Abraham and Sarah, a miraculous conception. God doesn't do it, as far as we can tell. So this family that is utterly and completely finished, Naomi believes that she has been cursed by God and cut off from the promises of God. And it's not in anything that God does to coerce the situation, but rather it's in the unprompted and uncoerced love and kindness and selflessness and conversion of the Moabite, Ruth, to the true God of Israel, that the promise of God is carried forward. And she's not the only woman in the lineage of Christ to carry on the lineage forward almost single-handedly. In fact, at the end of the book again, there's a great blessing that is pronounced by the village women on Naomi. And Tamar is brought up, and we'll get to that when we get to chapter 4. I won't explicate that now. But she is brought up because she single-handedly carries on the promise of God by her actions that get an entire chapter of the book of Genesis. Ruth gets an entire book. This is not the first or the only time that the lineage of Jesus, our Redeemer, came down to a single thread and rested on one person's decision. One of the reasons why the book of Esther is so valuable is because here we are with one person's decision, basically, in human history, deciding whether or not Israel will survive or die in genocide. What will happen to the promises of God then? What will happen to the promises of God when all things seem hopeless? That's the book of Ruth. And effectively, without really raising a finger, God's promises are advanced one step further. God's purposes are achieved through ordinary faithful people performing extraordinary acts of kindness. And that is the beauty of this great book. And it reminds us that, yes, God certainly has the power to fulfill his promises no matter what. But there are also times that God's promises and purposes are advanced and achieved by his heroic and faithful people. And as with Ruth, God's heroic people today can rise up from even the most unlikely, horrible circumstances and come from the most unlikely of places. It is not an Israelite who saves the day. It's a Moabite, against all odds, dedicated to the true God, giving up her entire life in order to do the right thing probably not even thinking about advancing the promises of God as we understand it. But that's what she did. By her simple and sincere faithfulness and loyalty to God. And hopefully in the weeks to come we'll share more of this great book. And certainly we want everyone to be a part of that great story that God is writing of the human race, that great story of redemption. Jesus has died for everyone. God has done magnificent things in order to bring us salvation in Christ. And we may not be able to do magnificent things like God does, but we can do the simple things. We can love God, and we can return his love for us by not only loving him, but by loving others each day of our lives. And we can start that out, if we haven't before, by obeying the gospel of Jesus, his Son. If you've never confessed your faith in Jesus as the Son of God, repented of your sins, and put him on in baptism for the remission of your sins, maybe tonight would be the night to do that. Or if you're a child of God and you need to come back home and make things right with him, won't you let us know as we stand and sing? Oh, to Jesus.